Well, thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm going to hand the floor over to Rita Walker, ARCA's board president, to kick us off.
Well, hi, everyone, and welcome to another informative ARCA Web Academy. These are great things. The self-determination program rolled out in 2018, but is still relatively new. It's one that offers great promise to many to design and manage their own services with all the new responsibilities and roles that go with that. So thank you in advance to tonight's presenters. Lastly, I don't think it's ever too frequently to call out the value of the small group discussions after the presentations. It gives us all a really unique opportunity to connect with each other as regional center board members across the state. We deal with so many of the similar things and oftentimes can learn from each other because centers, boards do some things differently. So again, welcome, enjoy tonight, and I turn it back over to you, Amy.
Awesome, thanks so much, Rita. And as Rita said, one of the things that we really think is super valuable in these experiences is the opportunity for regional center board members to chat with each other following the prepared presentation. So throughout the evening, as you're listening to the prepared presentation, one of the questions we always ask people to consider so that you're prepared to talk about it during the breakout sessions is what that you heard this evening would you like to take back to your board for further consideration and discussion. We're thrilled to have presenters with us this evening to talk about the self-determination program in California and to talk about both its promise and some of the challenges that have presented themselves through its implementation. So I'd first like to ask Charles Nutt from Far Northern Regional Center to share his story with us. Charles?
Hello, everyone. My name is Charles Nutt, and I live in Magnolia, California, which is in Butte County. I'm a self-advocate, chair of the Far Northern Regional Center Self-Determination Advisory Committee, and chair of the State Council of Development of Disability North State Office Regional Advisory Committee. I also wear many other hats. I would like to thank everyone for allowing me to share my health and wellness story. Several years ago, I weighed 400 pounds. I started having health issues, so I knew I needed a change. I did not think I could change, but with self-determination and consistency, I was able to get myself down to 300 pounds. That brings us to the point in December of 2020. I was experiencing health problems, lots of pain. I went to a kidney specialist, and I was diagnosed with diabetes. The kidney specialist told me that I needed to lose more weight. So I needed to plan to lose weight faster. So I prayed for a solution. And I heard about a new service model being offered through the regional centers called self-determination, and decided to sign up for a new kind of approach to my services. I got involved in the new self-determination program I learned about through Far Northern Regional Center and the State Council on Development Disabilities. I was appointed to the Self-Determination Advisory Committee, and now I'm the chair. For my name on the soft rollout, I was eventually selected during the second rollout to the self-determination program. I created a plan to accomplish my dreams. Through my goals and planning, I developed my budget and spending plan. Through the budget, I was able to choose what I wanted. And what I wanted was to purchase exercise equipment, including a treadmill, exercise bike, and a Bowflex machine. I was able to hire my own staff to help me with my goals. I was able to pay them a decent wage out of my budget. Through the support of my previous independent living skills worker, Steve helped me get from 400 pounds to 300 pounds by walking long distances, but it took a couple of years. I needed more, so for the self-determination program, I received the exercise bike and Bowflex machine. My wife purchased a treadmill. Now I need structure through planning. I was able to have a support from a health coach through my wife's insurance. I was gave my health ways of changing. One time I found that I needed a surgery for a hernia. The doctor was not going to do the surgery until I got myself down to 255. Through the help of myself and my support through my self-determination program, the persistence and accomplishment, my goals. I'm able to get myself down to 250. I accomplished my goals, and you can too. I was successful in reaching my personal and health goals. Thanks again for the support and listening to my health and wellness story. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles, both for your willingness to share your story as well as for your service on your local volunteer advisory committee and on the state council's statewide group as well.
I loved what I'm doing.
It's good to love what you do, right?
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Charles. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Liz Harrell, who is the Community Services Director for Eastern Los Angeles Regional Center. Liz?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. And actually, if we can pull up the PowerPoint, that would be great. So my name's Liz Harrell, and I work with the Eastern Los Angeles Regional Center, and it's really true to what was just said, to love what you do. I love what I do. I left the Regional Center for a little while, and I went right back because I love what I do with the Regional Center. And I'm so excited to talk to you today about self-determination. I need to adjust my screen so I can see what I'm talking about, though. There we go. That's better. Okay, so and I was charged with talking with you about the history of self-determination from the pilot phase to the law. So I'm sort of the one that talks about the promise, but I do have to say, you know, I've been in the system for about 33 years. I was born into it. I have an older brother with autism, but working with regional centers, it's been about 33 years, several different regional centers along the way, but primarily self-determination with Eastern Los Angeles Regional Center. I've been there now 25 years, and actually throughout my career at East LA Regional Center, managed the pilot project. So it is something that there is a pretty good foundation with the little pilot that we managed there. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about that and how we started that and how that grew. Started with the small pilots here in California and how that finally evolved into the law and into the program that folks are familiar with today. So we can go to the next slide. Thanks. And so these are the things I'm going to talk about. I know I only have 15 minutes and I have a timer going, so I'm not going to horn in on anybody's time. We'll keep going to the next slide. All right, so the history and philosophical background, it's really important when we talk about self-determination to understand, you know, that it is rooted in a concept that is not just about, well, you get a budget and then you buy things, et cetera, but that there's actually a true philosophical background, and it's rooted in really international civil rights, beyond just disability rights. I'm talking about when we talk about the concept of self-determination, that really means people reclaiming their citizenship. It means people saying, hey, I have a place at the table. I'm a decision maker as well, and I need to be welcomed at the decision-making table. And so really what happened was the disability rights movement internationally embraced that concept and said, well, so for us, what does that look like? For us to truly be at the table, it means we have to have control over how the resources are spent for us. We really need to have more of a voice and more authority over those dollars. And so that's something that was explored again in other countries. We're really starting to experiment with the concept of individual budgets, of people making decisions for themselves around the services that they would receive. And it came to the United States in the late 1980s into the 1990s, and through the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, there were grants set up in various states. And a gentleman by the name of Tom Nerney, people may know, he was sort of the guru of self-determination here in the United States, started working on the concept of how does this really look in our country, because there was a real crisis. And frankly, you know, California was somewhat protected from it in regards to services because we have this beautiful Lanterman Act, right? But in other states, as you know, there are waiting lists for services. People were not entitled to have services. And so self-determination became a way for many states to be able to sort of spread out the resources that people need to live their meaningful lives in the community. So we can go to the next slide. Thanks. So the California pilot. So basically what happened was in 1999, which is now so long ago, the Lanterman Act was amended, and 3 regional centers were named to pilot this thing called self-determination. And it was recognized back then. Again, remember what I said, the Lanterman Act, there's nothing like that anywhere else, right? The Lanterman Act is civil rights legislation. The Lanterman Act says if you have a developmental disability in California, you're entitled to a life in the community and you're entitled to the services and supports you need to have that life. So here we have this beautiful law, and then it's like, so, but there's this concept of self-determination, which was very intriguing for a couple of reasons, right? 2 reasons. One, to meet the changing needs of the folks we serve, right? And as cost containment. I'll tell you, that was one of those are the 2 sort of balanced things coming in that really, at that point, when the law was amended to include self-determination, those were the things that were really being looked at. So those 3 original regional centers were Eastern Los Angeles Regional Center, Redwood Coast, and Tri-Counties. And they were chosen because Redwood Coast was rural, Tri-Counties was urban, and East LA, well, we were the ethnically diverse regional center. And some of the things that were very unique at that point, that was the first time it was written into law that we had to partner with the area board, what's now known as state council. Regional offices back then were called the area boards. And there had to be a jointly appointed local advisory committee. Sounds similar to now, right? So some of these things I want you to know, even though it's newer, it was rooted in the original launch of these pilots. We can go to the next slide. And at that point, there was a state steering committee, and it wasn't like the one that's in place now, but that steering committee included the folks from DDS, from the various regional centers, self-advocates, parents, and area board, as well as, gosh, I think it was still called PAI back then, OCRA. So, and really that committee guided how this pilot was going to roll out. And there were basically, they wanted to kind of stay away from too many rules. And so really there was some just basic guidance in regards to how these pilots would roll out, but there was a lot of freedom in how to do it because there was the desire to experiment. And, you know, we brought in all sorts of people then. We used to meet once a month and we had, you know, legislators meeting with us. We brought in John Nerney. We brought in a guy by the name of Tom Nerney and John Augusta, who was like the guru of what was called brokers, what we now call independent facilitators. He came from Canada and met with us just to kind of figure out how are we going to design this to roll out. And we came to some basic conclusions. You know, one thing, of course, that to be true to in self-determination is the concept of an individual capitated budget. And that was really a hard thing to wrap our head around. Because remember, in California, Lanterman Act, you don't have a budget. There's no limit. So how are we going to determine how much money to give people? Right. So sound familiar? So that was a big challenge, and that this would have to be voluntary. It would not be anything that people would be forced to go into or kept in, or that, you know, or not allowed to have either, that it would be something that would be voluntary when it rolled out. There was universal acceptance that the purchase of service standards, purchase of service guidelines, whatever they're called at your regional center, they would not apply, but there would need to be some very basic rules. It would have to, the item and the services would have to be legal. So we used to joke, you can't set up that crack lab you wanted to set up, right? It has to be legal. You can't do any physical harm. So that meant that, you know, acupuncture, I hurt you, right? So you have to, somebody should be licensed, etc. And that it must be reasonably related to the IPP. These were the 3 rules. There was no requirement for federal dollars. At that point, there was no requirement to be compliant with HCBS or federal billing. That came later with the pilots, but when it first rolled out, these were the first. There was a lot of freedom in the design of these. So we all kind of went our separate ways. Oh, I just clicked because I thought it's me, but I'm going to have to ask you to go to the next slide. So, you know, the pilots, some of the other things we had to learn about. I mentioned the concept, brokers and fiscal intermediary, what are in our language now is called the independent facilitator, and the FMS, the fiscal management service back then was the brokers and fiscal intermediary. How would these things work with us? How would a broker, is that the same as a service coordinator? What would that look like? It had to be cost neutral. That was a requirement of the program. It couldn't cost any more to run. It couldn't cost any more for the purchase of service, although there were startup dollars to launch the pilots, and there would be an evaluation by an outside consultant. So we can go to the next slide. And within a year, 2 more regional centers joined, and those 2 regional centers were San Diego, and I can't believe that I'm blanking on the other one, but we had 5 of them. There were several extensions that was only supposed to be, can you believe this, a 3-year pilot. So back in 1999, I was like on the road telling people then, hey, self-determination's coming, get ready, you know, and training people on what to do and telling our staff. And so it really was thought, it really was truly believed that by 2002, that self-determination would be launched across the state. And that did not happen. There was the evaluation, the startup funds dried up, but for a variety of reasons, between the budget, politics, etc., the idea was we'll keep extending it and extending it. And that is kind of what happened. So it kind of just went along in its own way in the different 5 pilots. So we can go to the next slide. Some of the other terms that you hear for self-determination: individualized funding, self-directed services, but it's always the same premise with self-determination, right? It's an allocation of money directly to the person to meet their disability-related needs. We can go to the next slide. And I knew it would happen. I'm sorry, I'm working at home and my dog and cat like to wrestle, and they're wrestling behind me. So it's a little distracting. You may see them roll by, but they're not hurting each other. The objective of self-determination really is to support folks to participate fully in community life, and that they would control the funding for those services so they can have that citizenship, again, that place at the table. And we can go to the next slide. This is going to seem familiar to you, except you're going to be, if you know your self-determination, you're going to say, Liz, you're wrong. There's not 4, there's 5 principles. Well, this is a trick. Okay, so originally back in the day, there were only 4 principles. And you probably know these. Hopefully folks that know self-determination know the 4 principles: freedom, authority, support, and responsibility. And we can kind of zip through those because, again, I don't want to take from other people's time, but I think people are aware we can just go through the slides. The freedom to plan your life plan, basically, the authority to have control over those resources, over the dollars and the decision making. We can go to the next slide. That support, and that was a big one to talk about at that time. People were really afraid of self-determination was going to put them out of business. Service coordinators were worried, well, that means they don't need me anymore. But the concept here is support, and that's not going to go away. It's just being kind of configured in a different way. And we can go to the next one. The next slide. Responsibility. The responsibility to make decisions and choices. The responsibility to contribute back to your community. That was a big one. And that was one both John Augusta and Tom Nerney talked to us a lot about. Responsibility isn't just accounting for the spending of tax dollars, which is a biggie. And you are taking that on when you're in self-determination. You do have to be responsible with these taxpayer dollars. But there's also this responsibility to say, I'm a leader. If I'm going to sit at the table, I am responsible to contribute back to my community. So then we go to the 5th principle. We can go to the next slide. And that was added in 2000 at the International Self-Determination Conference. And that was the concept of confirmation. Nothing about me without me. And that was a really big deal. The recognition that consumers and parents have to play a leadership role in this model of service delivery. And I point this out and the importance of this because as I'm sort of zipping through this, but when we launched the pilot, when the state of California launched the pilot, we did a lot of things right. But we did it in the old way of doing things, right? It was led by the department. It was led by the regional centers and the state council, and people were invited to the table. But it wasn't led by the people getting the services. It was very much tiered in regards to you're being asked to sit at the table, being asked a question, and thank you so much, you'll leave now. Now we'll make the decisions. So, you know, and because that's how we knew how to do things, right? And so when you start to realize that there was this rumbling, not necessarily in California, but across the country around, hey, we want to, when we say at the table, we mean nothing about me without me. And it's interesting when you look at the history of self-determination. We can go to the next slide. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our project, but I want to say, when you look at the history of this turning into a law, and when it finally turned into a law, it was parents and advocates. It was parents and self-advocates that did that. The system we tried so hard for many years to expand self-determination. So it's an interesting outcome. I do just want to very briefly, I'm not going to take too much of your time again, because I want to be mindful of time here. Just to let you know, at our pilot project, we had 5,000 consumers. It was a long time ago, because we have over 12,000 now. And we actually, our advisory committee, we decided to target 4 target groups: kids with autism, kids with medical needs, adults 22 to 35, and 35 and over. And you know what was unique about our pilot project that I just want to point out is that we always looked at self-determination as a way to address disparity. That was written into our original project back in 1999. I was looking at the language we wrote back then. You know, we had the lowest per capita spending in POS back then on individuals we served, and it was completely down to language and ethnicity. And so we said self-determination is a way to address this. It's a way to maybe equalize our system and provide people with opportunities to really obtain those services. So we can move on to the next slide. So I'm going to move on. So we ended up with 32 participants. We can go to the next slide. Again, diverse community. We had 1 service coordinator. We used, I just want to point out to you, much like the fiscal, much like the independent facilitator, our brokers were choice. They were not imposed. At some regional centers, people were assigned a broker. With the fiscal intermediary, we broke that up into bill paying and employer of records, kind of like the way the FMS is now, only the regional center kept the bill paying part. We said, hey, we know how to do that part and we do it well, but we're going to set up a whole other office, just self-determination, just doing the bill paying. But that part about you hiring employees, no, we'll contract and you contract out for that. That's where we really looked at the FMS, what's called the FMS now. And it was actually very efficient. We'll go ahead and move on. I'm talking faster. Again, I think that, you know, I just want to point out from this slide, probably the importance of ongoing training. We had to build another system and it took a long time, even though it was a 3-year pilot. That's why we needed to extend it. It took a long time to really, again, figure out how to build a new system. We'll move on to the next slide. So for us, our challenge, and again, remember, each regional center had the freedom to figure out how to do budget determination themselves. At our regional center, how do you build a budget? We were like, oh no, we're not doing history because our people are the lowest per capita. That's not, how do you serve a population that doesn't use services, right? So the way we did it, we can go to the next slide, is we looked at, again, remember we had 4 target groups, and that was purposeful. So we said, okay, children with autism. So we're going to look at how much was spent on all children with autism and how much was spent on your child with autism. And that's your range. You are given this range. Then you have a person-centered plan and you finalize a plan and your budget needs to fall within that range. So people that had not very much spent on them, well, they were able to elevate up to a certain limit, right? That was spent on people with autism. People where maybe they were higher than that, well, then that was their top. Then it was sort of their historical costs, right? And again, similar to now, of course, there were reasons why maybe budgets were adjusted, but this worked beautifully well for us. But it was very labor intensive, you know, it's a lot of planning, a lot of time. And plus, of course, you have to have target groups. So it was done differently than how we do it now in self-determination. But we found it to be quite successful. We'll move to the next slide. And this is what I already told you, so we can move to the next slide. So what did we learn from all this? Well, we learned a lot. We learned the people were so happy. People were so happy in self-determination. And what happened was the POS costs were neutral to less. When we talk about the 20 years, basically, that we watched this pilot, what happened was when people started in self-determination, it went up because they all bought stuff right away. And then it leveled, and then it stayed level. And meanwhile, over here in traditional services, things are going up, up, up. Well, our self-determination people, they stayed level, 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 level. And then because it went on for so long, all those kids grew up. So remember, they hit about 21. That's when you saw things go up and then again level. We also learned that people tended to use they fell into using more traditional services, except in the case of supported living. That's where people said, I don't want to work with an agency, want to hire my own staff. But generally, they wanted to use traditional services. They just configure it in different ways. We also learned it took a long time to get people set up, months and months before people got their individual budget, usually about 3 to 6 months because it took such intensive planning. We can go to the next slide. More time in initial planning, that's what I just said, huh? Tracking budgets has always been challenging. We figured out that for some folks, it just didn't, there were some folks who voluntarily left the pilot. They felt like it was just a lot of work and it wasn't working for them. We also learned that regional centers could do it. It just was a matter of figuring out how to kind of navigate all the, and we'll talk about that, all these new roles and all the different ways to interact with providers and with families and with the folks we serve. We can go to the next slide. Okay, we mentioned there were a couple of times, and this brings me back to my point before. We tried, right? So back in 2005, yeah, it was self-directed services was written into the budget, and the concept of expanding this pilot fizzled out, didn't work. Individual choice budget, that was one a little bit newer, 2010, and that one too fizzled out. We can go to the next slide. So how did we get to where we are now? Well, what happened was in 2013, and these parents will tell you, they all met like at an airport bar and wrote the law on the back of a napkin. Basically, it was 2013. Parents got together with some advocacy groups and said, we are tired of waiting for self-determination. They were probably like, we're tired of that Liz Breen, who then became Liz Harrell, talking about this for 20 years, that this is coming. It's like there were people kind of out in the woods saying it's coming. It's like, we don't want to wait anymore. And so they turned it into a law. What can I say? So, by 2013, it was law, right? It took a good 5 years to move from the law for that waiver to be approved, because what was written in the law, of course, was that there had to be the federal funding, that it had to be billable services. And so there was work involved at the departmental level of getting that waiver approved to make sure that this program could roll out. Once that waiver was approved, it rolled out, right? We had the 3 years of the what was called soft rollout, 2,500 folks selected. And then by just this July, it was open to all. So it was quite a journey to get us here. And I think that's probably, I don't think I have another slide, right? We can go to the next one. Yeah, so that is my time. I tried to stick to 15 minutes very quickly to get us from pilot to law. And now here's the reality of what's going on. And I'm going to hand it over to Antoinette, who's the Director of Children's Services over at Harbor. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. I was just thinking, I joined the regional center system in 2005, and all this was already well underway. So it's pretty cool to hear the courageousness of people who go before you. As Liz mentioned, my name is Antoinette Perez. I'm Director of Children's Services at Harbor Regional Center. I also have the pleasure of overseeing Harbor's self-determination program and chairing the Regional Center statewide task force on SDP. Next slide. So we know that SDP can be complicated and hard to understand for many. And when we think about SDP, there are key components of the program that we want to make sure potential participants understand. And there are specific considerations that we will make when helping a participant progress through the program. I have them listed on this slide here, but we will break them down in the slides to come. Next slide. So one of the requirements of the program is that each potential participant must attend an orientation. The orientation will give the potential participant information about roles, responsibilities. It will dispel myths and clarify facts about the program, and ultimately help the individual decide if SDP is for them. Each regional center provides their own orientation, and the orientations may have a different feel on, based on the unique, details for a given center. The orientation can be in person, via Zoom, or through a pre-recorded module. Many centers will honor an orientation that is given at another regional center. For example, if a Harbor client wants to go on down to San Diego and attend an orientation there, because maybe they're having a family trip to Legoland, they can do so. And I just need to communicate with Susie to confirm that the potential participant attended the orientation. Next slide. So very important in SDP, but not required, is the development of a person-centered plan. This is different than the plans developed with the regional centers. So although regional centers stand behind our plans and believe that we always take a person-centered approach when developing an IPP, for SDP, these plans are more comprehensive and they're considered a staple in SDP. DDS has authorized regional centers to provide funding for up to $2,500 for a participant to have a PCP developed. Anything above that dollar amount would require approval from the from DDS. But they have authorized amounts higher than that. But for the most part, I think PCP plans cost about $2,500. Not all participants choose to have an independent person-centered plan developed. Some may choose to do it themselves, and others may choose to work with the document developed by the regional center. Next slide. So now every participant of SDP will have an individual budget. Basically, Liz mentioned this briefly, is that, basically a dollar amount for them to coordinate services and supports over a 12-month period. Regional centers are responsible for establishing each participant's budget and certifying that the dollar amount would have been spent if the individual remained in traditional services. And Welfare Institutions Code 4685.8 speaks to that. Very important is that should a participant obtain an independent facilitator to help them navigate SDP, and later on I'll describe what an independent facilitator is for those that don't know, any charges that the IF makes will come out of the individual budget. Regional centers cannot increase a budget to cover those costs. Also, the required financial management services must also come out of the budget. And I will talk more about that in a few slides. Next slide. Okay, good. Hold on, Amy. It jumped for me. Okay. Let me see if I can get there. Where are you, Katie? You just hold it there. Sorry. My screen jumped. Okay. Okay, here we go. So in essence, so we look at the total amount of services spent on an individual over the previous 12 months. So what Liz mentioned earlier too, we do that. We look at the last 12 months of spending on an individual, and we come up with that total. We subtract what we call one-time costs, such as, this may be a purchase of a conference or any item that is not expected to continue, not to be ongoing. And we would not, and then there's an assessment of needs and addition of funds to cover services and supports that are newly identified or have been identified in the past, but for whatever reason, the participant wasn't able to access that. Next slide. There are specific services and supports that are designated to be handled outside of an individual budget, meaning the regional center would coordinate through purchase of service funding like in traditional services. I have them listed on this slide, but you should know that there is some advocacy to have some of these services include an individual budget. But for now, these are the services that we would handle outside of the budget. Next slide. Now, the spending plan lays out how the dollar amount in an individual's budget will be spent. It lists the services, the provider, and dollar amount allocated to each specific service and support that will help the individual achieve their goals. Regional centers do not assist with developing the spending plan. The participant or a member of their circle of support, or if they choose an independent facilitator, will do this work. Important to note is that parents of minor children cannot be paid for their goods and services, but parents of an adult child can. All spending plans must include the fees for the required financial management services, and I'll say more about that later. And a very important consideration is that services and supports, even in SDP, must meet federal requirements. That's something Liz mentioned as well. Next slide. So if you go on the DDS website, they have the links there, a complete list of service definitions. I'm not going to go over those, but they're all there. Next slide. So I have mentioned the required financial management services in several of the previous slides, but it is the one required service for our participants. The FMS handles the business aspect of things, managing the budget, doing work background checks for potential providers. FMS offer 3 models, which I will describe in the next slide. So bill payer, least expensive and least amount of liability on the participant. FMS pays the provider directly. And then you have the sole employer. The participant is the provider's actual employer. There's increased liability here, and the participant will have to obtain liability insurance. And then you have co-employer. This is a combination of the other two, with both participant and the FMS acting as the employer, but the FMS does some of the heavy lifting on liability. Next slide. So a little bit more about the independent facilitator. This is not a required service, but due to the complexity of SDP, many participants find the service essential. The independent facilitator helps them navigate all aspects of SDP. The amount that an independent facilitator can charge is not regulated, and so you will see service costs in the hundreds to the thousands. Next slide. Another important consideration is the HCBS final rule, which was issued in January of 2014. It promotes integration and inclusion, and providers, like all the providers that have been in the business for a long time, must become compliant by March 2023. But in SDP, providers must be compliant now in order for the services to be authorized in a spending plan. DDS recently offered some guidance in March this year, sharing assessment tools that can be used to assess a provider's compliance with the final rule. Next slide. So lastly, what everyone likes to hear is that a participant has gone live in the program. This means the participant no longer is part of the traditional service delivery system and is fully operating in SDP. Some will be placed on the SDP waiver. There's other waivers that they can be on as well, depending on their circumstance. This requires communication between the regional centers and DDS. Okay, next slide. And in case you're wondering, all rights afforded in the traditional service delivery model remain in SDP. Disagreement about services between a participant and the regional center can be handled by the participant exercising their due process rights and appealing the regional center's decision and having the matter heard and decided by a judge. Next slide. So this is my last slide before I turn it over to Susie. Important to know is that a participant can exit SDP at any time and return to traditional services immediately. But if they want to return to SDP after exiting, they must wait 12 months before they can do so. Meanwhile, the regional center is going to work closely with the participant to make sure there are no gaps in services. Now it's all yours, Susie.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Susie Rekorth. I'm the Self-Determination Project Manager for San Diego Regional Center. So let's talk about some of the challenges, because guess what? It hasn't necessarily been all roses as we've gone through it. I was listening to Liz talk a little bit about the history, and I think at one point, Liz, you even said that some things were working beautifully, and that gives me hope that someday we'll be able to say we've got things working beautifully. And I'm optimistic because we have a lot of tools at our disposal. So what I want to do is talk with you all about what some of the more significant challenges are that we've seen. But I don't like to talk about challenges or problems without also talking about the resources we have to address those challenges. So I'm going to actually start with some of those. We can go to the next slide. All right, so before we jump into the specifics on some of the barriers we've seen, every local advisory committee, which Liz talked about, and I think Antoinette touched on as well, every local advisory committee has access to what are called self-determination implementation funds. Every regional center / local advisory committee is awarded a certain amount of implementation funds by the state. So far, we've gotten them every fiscal year, starting in 2019-2020 fiscal year. And the state has also told us, hey, and here's some ways that you guys can spend this money. And the goal is to support people enrolling in self-determination and being successful in self-determination. So I'll refer back to these implementation funds as something that we have drawn upon to address some of the challenges. Next slide. All right, and last year in the 2021 Budget Act, money was included to fund a new position within regional centers called a participant choice specialist. Every regional center, I believe, has the authorization for 2 of these, some of them more, but that just happened in 2021. So now regional centers have actively been hiring additional staff that can help support directly with self-determination, in addition to some of the other participant-directed service models and some of that outreach to diverse communities. Next slide. And I wouldn't want to leave out the state. As a state, we have done a lot of different things to help the community along with self-determination. Obviously, a lot of statewide efforts are led and driven by parents, self-advocates, other family members. So I'll bring those into the conversation as well as we go through some of those challenges. Next slide. All right, challenge number one. I know everybody's here to hear the gossip on what's not going well. That's what we do best as a society, right? Let's talk about what's not going well. So let me give you that information. There have been some frustrations with the length of time. It takes a while. I think we heard Liz talk about the planning, the intensive planning that went into self-determination from very early on in its implementation. Antoinette described all of the steps. There are a lot of things that have to happen, especially in that enrollment phase. And so what we're seeing now is mostly people are concerned about how long it's taking to get a certified budget, meaning how long it takes to get that amount of money they're going to have to work with, and then how long it takes to develop a spending plan for that money and have everyone in the IPT planning team give it the thumbs up and move it forward. So those things do take some time. We've also gotten feedback from individuals and families that the process is difficult and that it really requires a significant time commitment. And that's something that we definitely, as a community, want to address because we want self-determination to be accessible to anyone who might be interested in the service delivery model. It's new. It's not brand new. Obviously, it's been around for a couple of decades in different versions, but the self-determination we have right now, the program we have right now is new. So there's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of misunderstandings out there of who's responsible for what do the laws and regulations mean? How do we complete all of these steps to enrollment? And, you know, I'd point out that like so many other things in the last few years, the rollout of self-determination was significantly impacted by COVID. And so a large portion of that 3-year soft rollout that Liz mentioned was really that 3 years that we hoped to learn a lot and have kind of a smaller group of people that knew what they, knew that they were the first ones coming into it and we could all learn together. And a lot of that did happen, but a lot of it was interrupted by the pandemic. And so when July 1st of 2021 came along, now we have a lot of people that are coming into self-determination and they're eager and it's available to everyone. So we must have it all figured out now, right? And we're getting closer to that, but we're not quite there yet. And so I think that's where some of the misunderstandings have come in, is some of that learning time was impacted. The person-centered planner and independent facilitator community has very limited capacity still. So one of the things that DDS and the statute provided information on was how can people have support with this enrollment process? And one of the things in there is having access to person-centered planning support. It's more than just the IPP, as Antoinette was talking about. A person-centered plan is a very comprehensive plan of services, of what someone wants their life to look like. And it's really important for someone going through that process of enrollment, because now they're taking that responsibility principle into their court and they're creating their support network. They're creating what day-to-day life looks. They're finding what those services and supports might be. So having a person-centered plan that goes beyond just what regional center traditional services might look like is so important to people being able to envision that life for themselves. So there is support for person-centered planning, and there's also support for people in the transition stage, enrollment stage, to have someone paid to provide some of the roles that an independent facilitator might fill. So thinking back to that term broker that Liz brought up, that would be what independent facilitators are typically doing. So helping someone find the actual people that are going to be part of their support plan, helping someone decide how to budget their money so that they're getting a full 12 months of services and supports that they need. So it's there in theory, but there's got to be people to actually be the person-centered planners and be the independent facilitators. And so that's been one thing that the community is still trying to keep up with is having those people available. And also availability of service providers in general. That's happening everywhere right now. It's hard to find staff. It's hard to fill all your positions in so many different businesses right now. And that applies to self-determination. People are having a hard time finding people to actually do the work and be hired on. And that also includes financial management services. So we can go next slide. Keep track of my time here. So addressing the challenges in the enrollment process, we have those implementation funds. A lot of regional centers and local advisory committees are deciding to use a significant amount of those implementation funds to have additional funding and support available during the transition phase, training more independent facilitators, providing coaching services through agencies or organizations in the community that might be able to do that. We have participant choice specialists. They're able to provide more support to their colleagues so that there's not as much confusion during the enrollment process. They're there to mentor them and help them move forward with the family or with that individual. And they're also available to the community. And over the last few years, DDS has released a lot of guidance documents that clarify certain things. So some of those areas where there have been more misunderstandings or just different understandings of what the law says, DDS has provided some additional information to help with that. Next slide. All right, the next big challenge that we've seen has to do with the financial and the business components of self-determination. So, while I don't know that anyone would necessarily say that our billing system for traditional services is a well-oiled machine, it works for what it works for, and it's been there for a long time, and so everyone understands it. But in self-determination, that billing system doesn't necessarily work that well. And so we're seeing some challenges with that. So for instance, the steps that have to happen for someone's money to be authorized for them to actually spend it and for it to be available to the financial management service, it can take several steps. It can take lots of different people getting involved. And if there's one error, kind of like the game of telephone, if there's one error, it may not get to the final step and have to start over again. And that's impacting people's ability to move their money around and exercise that authority over their services. Because at any point in that 12-month period, if they decide they want to spend more money on one thing than another, all of that process has to happen again to move that money from one area to another. Doesn't matter if it's $5 or $10,000. And so that's something that has been an issue. And it's been hard for the FMS providers as well, because it's requiring more administrative workload and responsibility on their end. And that's affecting their capacity and their ability to support the number of people that want to move forward with self-determination. So we can go next slide. Okay, so we still have our work cut out for us here, but there have been a lot of efforts in the last couple of years, especially in the last 6 months, to really support the FMS community, to support participants in understanding what they can expect from an FMS and what they need to provide for that FMS to support them. We're really using those participant choice specialists right now to train service coordinators, work with the business services departments within regional centers to make that authorization of funding go faster, to get those authorizations in place faster and with less errors so that they don't have to be corrected. DDS has put together a number of work groups and focus groups to talk about some of the challenges that have come up with this financial side of self-determination. And we've actively been looking for ways to make that process go more smoothly. So we've definitely been using everything at our disposal. Some of the regional centers, ours included, are also using those implementation funds to provide coaching support to people even after they've enrolled in self-determination. So they have some extra support when they need to do things like move money around and change their spending plans. So we're using those resources we have, and we're learning as we go. And next slide, Amy. All right, and I'm ending on this third challenge because I think this one is really important and not one that we talk about as much as some of the other logistical things, but switching from the mindset of how traditional services are set up and accessed right now to self-determination it's a paradigm shift. It's a different way of thinking about life and services and support networks. And one of the biggest things that's a change for people is the responsibility component. And so we really want to, as a community as a whole, take some time to look at how are we supporting each other, ourselves, regional centers, participants, how are we supporting everyone in understanding how this responsibility has shifted and how to meet that responsibility. And, you know, self-determination goes right back to that person-centered principle and person-centered thinking. Those are things that as a system, hopefully we've been embodying for years and years, but in self-determination, it takes on this elevated role because again, people are creating the life that they want to live. They're starting from the ground up. And so, you know, to come into a situation where you're thinking beyond just traditional services, you have to know how to think beyond traditional services. And that's where that person-centered planning really comes in. And it's exciting, but it's also hard and it's different. So I think at this point, since we're you know, on time, I think, Amy, I could just share the link to some of the video testimonials that we have posted on our website. We also got to hear from Charles, so I know you guys got to hear firsthand from some people that, for someone participating in self-determination, but it's always good to hear it straight from the person living the experience, and we do have some video testimonials on the SDRC website that I'd be happy to share with you all.
All right. Thank you to our presenters who walked us through over 20 years of history in 45 minutes. So that's not bad. And really appreciate your willingness. Just wanted to check if there are questions for our presenters. I saw Dan's hand come up and down a couple of times, so wasn't sure if there was a question, Dan. All right, in the meantime, Amy, I see you have a question.
Yeah. Allocation and the other money definition, what is the difference? Amy, look.
So I think one of our presenters used the term allocation. Are you asking what that means?
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that was in one of my slides. I used that word. It basically means an amount. An allocation is yeah. It's like if you think of it as this is how much you will get. So it's a certain amount of money. Does that answer your question, Amy?
Yes.
Okay.
Other questions? JC.
Hi, everybody, and I am on the board at the Golden Gate Regional Center. But up until less than a year ago, I was actually a service provider for 42 years with the ARC San Francisco and hosted trainings. But a couple of things I was thinking about. I know a fair number of individuals that don't, for different reasons, have parental support. Because the families I know that went to the orientations and signed up for the pilot and afterwards were families where the parents were able to spend quite a bit of time and energy learning you know, taking workshops, asking a lot of questions, but there are individuals that are living in like supported living in different circumstances that they don't really have an advocate to help them. Parents are either, you know, it's aging parents that just for whatever reason really can't handle all the meetings. So I was wondering how these individuals could, or if they are supported, that don't have a family member or a caregiver that can really be behind this.
I can take a stab at this one. So it's a complex question and not one with an easy answer, as I'm sure you've seen. I think, you know, in San Diego, we really look at it as a two-prong approach, because there's the one component that people that don't have that strong natural support network, that's the community that really needs to have access to independent facilitators or strong person-centered planners that can really walk them through that process and help them put all the pieces together to make self-determination work. But there's also another component of it, which is who helps that person get to the point of looking for an independent facilitator or wanting an independent facilitator. And I think that's where regional centers training service coordinators really comes in, so that service coordinators are in a position when they meet with people regularly, and service providers too, that we're all educated and know what self-determination is and know how to help someone get to that point where they can access the independent facilitator community. So I think we really have to give equal attention to both things.
And the other thing I just wanted to mention was, and one of the speakers addressed it, I think COVID had a real impact on the enthusiasm and the resources. So a couple of families that I've known for a really long time, I used to do intake at the ARC, so you know, I got familiar with a lot of families. They backed out, and you know, I've encouraged them, well, maybe take another look at it, because you know, during COVID, when they were home, you know, with their sons and daughters, I mean, resources to look at things outside. I mean, even if it was to sign up with an agency, an established agency, there just weren't the resources out there. You want to take an art class, a dance class, get more exercise, you know, even, yeah. So, you know, and I'm not sure how we sort of ignite that that enthusiasm again, because I just think it is a wonderful program to promote. I know it's not for everybody. So you know, I just wanted to, you know, second that I think that COVID really had a diminishing effect on beginnings on the rollout.
Yeah, if I can just chime in, you know, absolutely agree with you. And you know, it's had a chilling effect on all of our service delivery in so many ways, from traditional to self-determination. But I think one thing that has emerged from this the pandemic is I think now what regional centers, what we're trying to do is really communicate that there's really a spectrum. There's self-determination, there's participant directed, there's funds being invested into explaining the concept of health and safety waivers to help people kind of think about, it doesn't have to be this sort of traditional way. It goes back to what Susie was talking about, helping people kind of see it doesn't have to always be the way it's been. And that's one thing we definitely learned through this pandemic, right? It does not have to be the way it's always been. You know, alternative services is in place. It's you know, eventually it'll probably phase out, but I mean, the genie's out of the bottle on that. You know, look at us all meeting this way. So it's sort of, it's how does it fit in to our communication around that? And I know at our regional center, we try and do a lot of work. Again, it's like what Susie was saying, it's around our service coordinators understanding and being able to communicate that, and coming from a place of not one size fits all, but that you know, there's sort of a buffet now, right? And our service providers, we do have our vendor advisory committee. We have a forum for our vendored service providers, And it's basically a learning community about self-determination. And, you know, what we're doing is we're fostering that understanding, but we're also fostering ambassadors, right? To explain it, to support folks. And because absolutely, and I can say for our pilot, I talk about our pilot, and the reality is it was a teeny little thing. So of course it worked, you know, the way it worked. But we did try and do exactly what you talked about. That was one of the reasons why we targeted a certain type of adult. And so we did have individuals that were living on their own without a lot of support, and really tried to get brokers with those people, match brokers who did things like knew the guy who had his haircut at the same place for 30 years and said, this guy should come to your person-centered plan because he knows you. So things like that, you know, but that takes that time, right? And it takes that understanding of how to even do that. So trying to scale that up, yeah, in the midst of the pandemic, it is very challenging. Just coming back around to what you're saying. Yeah, it's challenging, but I think there's opportunities too as a result.
I want to thank you all, because even though I've even hosted trainings for the regional center at the agency, which I'm no longer, and I am a board member now, I'm not getting paid by any agency, but I did learn some new things today. So I really appreciate that, and thank you. And I took notes, and I look forward to the PowerPoints to sort of remind me of things that I can share with the Golden Gate Regional Center board. So very much appreciate what you're doing.
Awesome. And thanks so much again to our presenters and for the questions that have come forward. At this point, we're going to transition into breakout rooms. We'll have about 20 minutes in the breakout rooms. And again, the topic of conversation is, what did you hear tonight that maybe you didn't know before, or that you want to discuss further with your board when you think more about self-determination as a board. So in just a moment, you'll get an invitation to join a breakout room, and we'll see you all back here in about 20 minutes.